Welcome everyone to the first lecture of Module 8, in which we're going to shift gears from learning about states and regimes and identities and gender and religion and political economy of the Middle East and North Africa to this next portion of our course, which focuses on 3 case studies. And for the next few weeks, we are going to be learning about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, obviously, we could have an entire class about this conflict. We don't. We only have 4 weeks to cover it. But I want to spend this amount of time to make sure that you all have a solid understanding of this conflict, since obviously it is still not resolved. It is an important issue, not only in the region, but around the world. So we're going to spend some time learning about it. But before we do that, I want to talk about some ground rules for our discussion and then just introduce some terms to you. So to begin with, what I have provided for you here are 2 definitions of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Now, there is a little bit of controversy with the definition of anti-Semitism. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IRA, has a definition that has been used in recent years to essentially stop any criticism of the Israeli government and its actions, and to call any critiques of government actions anti-Semitic. So in response to that, there are a number of scholars, like Holocaust scholars, genocide scholars, Middle Eastern and North African scholars, political scientists, scholars from a whole bunch of different disciplines, who came together and issued this Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, specifically in response to the fact that the IRA definition was starting to be used to basically prevent any criticism of the Israeli government, right? We can obviously, and we should, criticize the actions of governments, but we should not be engaging in stereotypes of people who live in countries. So that's what the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism focuses on. The UN also has a definition of Islamophobia. So I just wanted to mention, right, these are going to be kind of our guiding frameworks for when we're thinking about the conflict and where we're trying to assess in a critical way, using critical thinking skills, what has happened, what are the stories of Israelis, what are the stories of Palestinians, right? What has been going on in the conflict? So you can, and you should, read the definition from the JDA by either going to the QR code on your phone, or you can also just click on this link. But and so the page that you'll get to gives you a lot more context about it. I'll just go ahead and click on this here so you all can see what this looks like. All right, so this is the page of the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, right? It has like the preamble, it has the definition, it has people who have signed it, it has frequently asked questions, and it has also an about section, right? To talk about who these scholars are, who have decided and why they decided to come together to discuss this. So here is just an overview of how we define anti-Semitism, right? So basically, any time that you are engaging in stereotypes and you are making negative generalizations, right? Much like you can engage in racist comments, sexist, misogynist, right, xenophobic, similar type of framework is what scholars who came up with the ADA are focusing on, right? So just general definition. Then here are comments specifically about the Israeli and Palestinian conflict that, on the face of it, are indeed anti-Semitic, right? So these are the things that if you hear these types of comments, it is a good indication that people are trafficking and using anti-Semitic comments to critique what is going on. However, these are the types of statements that the ADA does not consider to be anti-Semitic, right? So just supporting Palestinian demands for justice, criticizing Zionism as a form of nationalism, right? Evidence-based criticism of Israel as a state, right? We should all be able to criticize states. Obviously, you cannot do that freely in some countries that are not democratic, but we live in a democracy. Israel, although there's some controversy around this when it comes to the territories of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem that it controls, right? But in general, Israel as a state is considered to be democratic, right? So you can critique what the Israeli government is doing, and we should, just like we should critique any government. The BDS, boycott, divest, and sanctions are not necessarily anti-Semitic, right? And political speech is also not. So these are just some of the ground rules, and I'm sure that you all already know this, but I did want to make sure that we're all on the same page with respect to what is considered to be Islamophobic, what is considered to be anti-Semitic. All right. So let's do a little bit of an introduction to the conflict. So one kind of common perception of the conflict is that it's this ancient hatred between Jews and between Muslims, and it goes back to like biblical times, and that's why this conflict has been so hard to resolve. So this is actually a picture in Jerusalem of the Western Wall and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is simply not true, though. This is what Tessler had mentioned in the reading for this week, right? Anybody who studies the conflict knows this is actually about two sets of people who want to have their own state, but they want to have their own state on the same piece of land. So this is genuinely a conflict over territory by two nationalist groups. Yes, religion obviously is a part of it because religion has been used as a mobilization tool for political purposes. But political Zionism, when it emerged in the late 1800s, as you'll learn about in this week, was not a religious movement at all, right? So this is genuinely a conflict about land. Now, even the terms Palestinians and Israelis are controversial. So this is a controversial conflict, and that's why we are going to study it in part so we know what the controversies are and we know how to actually engage with the material about it. So the term Palestinians was actually not used in the mainstream like media or any kind of circles until the 1980s. The term Israelis was actually not used by a lot of Arab states in the Middle East until the 1990s. So even these two terms, Palestinians, Israelis, those have some kind of loaded controversial history. Okay. What do we even call this piece of land? So obviously Israel is in fact a state and it exists. People do refer to Palestine, but I just want to clarify for everybody at this point, Palestine is not a state. The last time that I taught this class a few years ago, I had a student tell me at the end of the semester that one of the things that they learned was that in fact Palestine was not a state. They had thought that there was a state of Israel and a state of Palestine. There is no state of Palestine. Palestinians do not have anything that would even remotely resemble their own country. I think sometimes using the terms Israel and Palestine makes it seem to someone who doesn't know much about the conflict that these are two equal entities. They are not, right? Palestine is actually the region that was part of a British mandate following the end of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire fell apart and its territory was divided between the British and the French, and then Turkey got its own state. So just want to clarify that Palestine has historical significance, right? Some people do refer to Palestine, in part because maybe they'd like to see a Palestinian state, but there is no independent state of Palestine, all right? So we can also refer to this as Israel and the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, since technically those are the territories that Israel started to control militarily since after the 1967 war. Some people refer to these same pieces of land as Israel and the occupied territories because they are technically, by international law, under military occupation. And then you may also have heard people refer to it as Israel and Judea and Samaria. That is a perspective from the religious segment of the Israeli Jewish population that is referring to the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip by their biblical terms. And if you hear somebody referring to it as Israel and Judea and Samaria, you can be pretty sure that that individual would like to see Israel control that entire territory, either with Palestinians subjugated without having any rights, or even ideally with no Palestinians on that land at all. So even what to call this piece of land is controversial. Okay, next, what to call the quote-unquote wall. This was also in the Tesla reading, so you're going to, in the section about the Second Intifada, you're going to learn about the wall that Israel created. So some people refer to this wall as a security fence or a barrier, right? Other people refer to this as a separation wall or an apartheid wall. So there are different terms that people use depending on where they stand in the conflict, right? Are they more kind of pro-Palestinian? Are they more pro-Israeli? Even the wars are controversial in terms of how they are called. So Israel became independent in 1948. Israeli Jews may refer to this as the War for Independence, but Palestinians would refer to this as the Al-Nakba, Nakba being catastrophe. So again, we're going to get to this in one of the subsequent lectures, and it's in the reading, but essentially after Israel declared itself a state, there was war between like neighboring Arab countries. Palestinians ended up leaving for various reasons, right? Some of it was just fleeing. Some of it was being displaced, right? Some of it was due to, at the end of this conflict, and what seems to be an actual Israeli military policy of trying to remove Palestinians from the land. But Palestinians will refer to this as the Al-Nakba because 750,000 of them left the land that they had lived on for generations. Israelis refer to this conflict in 1948 as the War for Independence. 1967 is another great example. If you hear somebody refer to this as the Six-Day War, that in a way signifies that Israel was able to gain control over all of this territory in only 6 days. So that tends to be something that Israeli Jews, not all of them, but it tends to be something that you would hear more from Israeli Jews being mentioned as opposed to the June 1967 war, which does not try to highlight that it only took the Israeli military 6 days to achieve such a huge territorial gain. Okay, so that's just laying out some controversial terms and just to kind of set the stage for when we are talking about this conflict and when you are reading about it, sometimes there's so much misinformation that we just need to be aware of what the actual facts are, and we need to be aware of how the way in which the conflict is described might indicate to us the position that someone is advocating. So how big is Israel actually? It's not very big, right? Here is Israel on the left. Here is Maryland on the right in the US, right? We're talking about the same amount of territory. So here is more information about the size of Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, and Israel, right? So see here again in, for example, this infographic from Al Jazeera, which is using information that's like widely accepted. So there's nothing controversial about the information that's being presented, but you can see that, it's referred to as Palestine and Israel. So this is Israel, its size. This is the size of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and this is the size of Gaza. About the size of Detroit versus about the size of Delaware. All right, so who are the Palestinians? We often think about Palestinians as being Muslim because of organizations like Hamas, which is an Islamist organization, but not all Palestinians are Muslim at all. There are Palestinian Christians, there are Palestinian Druze. Yes, the majority of Palestinians are Muslim, but it's not monolithic. It's most certainly not 100%, right? Palestinians live inside and outside the territories, so they live within the territories of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem. Palestinians also live in Israel. There were Palestinians who stayed on the land in 1948 when Israel declared its independence, and so they do have citizenship in Israel. So when we talk about Israel, we're not just talking about folks who are Jewish. There is also a big Palestinian population in Israel, and Palestinians also live in the diaspora. Palestinians live in Jordan, they live in Lebanon, they live in neighboring Middle Eastern countries. They also live in the United States, right? Palestinians have been represented generally by this umbrella organization called the PLO, but that umbrella organization is composed of multiple different like smaller organizations or like unique organizations like Fatah, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Popular Front, right? Hamas, Islamic Jihad. So there are actually lots of organizations that represent Palestinians. Not all of them use violence. Okay, and this is again just to kind of show you where Palestinians are today. This is in 2020. Right, so you have 3 million out of 13 in the West Bank and Gaza, 2 million out of 13 3 million out of 13 in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, 2 million in Gaza, almost 2 million who are citizens of Israel, and then you have a significant percentage living in Arab countries as well as other countries. All right, so who are the Israelis? Well, Israel was established as a state in 1948. Zionism is a political movement that emerged in the late 1800s in response to discrimination that was happening in Europe against Jews. And so it is a movement that focused on self-determination and finding and creating a state for Jews to be able to live, right? So Israel, though Zionism was expressly founded as a self-determination movement for people of Jewish origin, Israel is not entirely Jewish. So Jews do make up 3/4 of the population, right? But you also have significant percentages of Muslims, small percentages of Christians, Druze rather, and other. And so, right, these Arab Israelis or Palestinian Israelis do make up nearly 20% or about 20% of the Israeli population. So when we're talking about Israelis, we need to clarify which Israelis are we talking about. And then you could see here the population of Israel in thousands according to their religious affiliation, right? This is not to say that all Jews are practicing. There's actually a lot of divisions within like the Jewish community with respect to where people have immigrated from, with respect to are they religious, are they non-religious, but generally, right, if we're kind of breaking it down, these are the different percentages. And so, as I just said, right, there are a lot of divisions among Jewish Israelis, much like there are divisions among Palestinians. So you have Israeli Jews who have immigrated from various countries around the world, some from Europe and America, those are the Ashkenazi, some from the Middle East, that's the Mizrahi, some that are Sephardim, those would be the Jews who lived in Spain before they were expelled in 1492. And so, right, here is like a breakdown of these intra-Jewish cleavages in Israel. And so where do we find people who are Jewish living today, right? 6.7 million out of 14.7 are in Israel, but we also see a big population in the US, France, Canada, and other countries. And so this is, I know, a little bit blurry, but this is looking at over time where we saw Jewish immigration to Israel. So where were immigrants? If you are Jewish, you are allowed to move to Israel and become a citizen, right? Where were we seeing waves of immigration coming from? And then in terms of political parties, there have traditionally been like two parties in Israel. Now, there's not just two parties. There's actually quite a lot of parties. Israel is like one big electoral district. It has a parliament called the Knesset that has 120 seats. More recently, it has not been the case, and it's a parliamentary system. So you have like a prime minister who is the leader of the party who won the majority of seats in the parliamentary elections, and that person is like the head of government. Now this is Benjamin Netanyahu, and he's been in that position for a number of years. But generally you see like two main divisions in Israeli politics, but it's not just two, right? So you had different periods where you had essentially the Labor Party dominating. Then you had a period of kind of competition between Labor and Likud specifically. And then from the 2000s to the present, there are a whole bunch of other parties that have really fragmented the Israeli political party system. I know this is a little bit teeny tiny and hard to read, but this is looking at the distribution of seats in the Israeli Knesset, the parliament. It's unicameral. There's no like upper and lower house. It's just one house. And we have seen, so this is just a few of the parties, right? And if we're going to try to put these parties on like a right and a left dimension, we have seen kind of a shift towards the right over time in Israeli politics, right? And that is it for this introductory lecture.